I'll be talking about modeling Van der Waals interactions. My understanding is that the audience here is pretty diverse, so I'll try to start a bit slower, but please, if at some point it becomes a bit technical, I'm sorry, but that's just the nature of the work. So yeah, sorry beforehand. All right, so what I'm interested in a broad term is modeling of molecules and materials. What this is really about is trying to, in some way, replace or supplement doing real experiments with molecules and materials in a lab and answering some questions about those materials, sort of instead modeling, building some models of those molecules and materials, then running calculations with them and answering the same kinds of questions. In practice, this is not really going to be a replacement, but it's a back and forth between experiment and calculations typically. And I also want to say that there's, of course, the maybe even more important question of going backwards, where you know some properties of your molecules and materials, and you want to go backward and sort of find the molecules and materials with those properties. So molecular design or material design. So I'm not going to talk about that. I'm talking about the forward direction, where you start with a material or molecule and you're interested in some properties of that. And when you do that, when you do modeling of molecules and materials, what you essentially do on a lower level is you're trying to model the interactions between the atoms. And the previous talk was essentially about trying to learn those interactions from data. And I'll be talking about how you can get those interactions from the underlying physics. And so then in a bigger picture, those calculations can then provide the data for a machine learning model that's built on that. And so very broadly, you can divide interactions between atoms in molecules and materials to two sort of big groups, intermolecular and intramolecular, where essentially, yeah, many molecules, many molecular systems and materials can be kind of understood as groupings of molecules, and then intramolecular interactions would be within those molecules, and intermolecular interactions would be between them. And chemistry is essentially about breaking and forming those intramolecular bonds. So there will be like split in a water molecule, things like that. Intermolecular in bonds, you wouldn't call them really bonds because the bonding is very weak, but let's say intermolecular bonds, they are really breaking and forming all the time at room temperature. So that's kind of what drives a lot of thermodynamics of everyday materials and molecules around you. And because of that, these intermolecular interactions are super important for being able to predict sort of thermodynamic properties, stability of many materials at sort of common temperatures. And this applies to most liquids, molecular crystals. So typically, you know, something like ice or something like a drug in a tablet, proteins, essentially all biological matter, layered solids, or whenever you have some industrial process that might happen on a surface, all these things are driven by intramolecular interactions. And then one part of that group of intramolecular interactions would be dispersion or Van der Waals interactions. This terminology is kind of depending on what kind of people you talk to. So physicists tend to call them Van der Waals forces, and by that they mean this weakest dispersion. When you talk to chemists, they often will consider all intramolecular interactions to be called Van der Waals forces, and then dispersion is just that tiny group. So the terminology can be a bit confusing. I'll be using Van der Waals and dispersion interchangeably for the weakest part of intermolecular forces. And this weakest part is, you know, so yeah, it's very weak. And so on the atomic scale, it can be some sort of you might consider it negligible. But what's kind of interesting about it is that it's always attractive. And so as you go to larger systems, whereas some of the stronger intermolecular interactions can cancel out or average out, the Van der Waals forces don't. And so as you go to larger scales, more complex materials, the dispersion forces can become increasingly important. Okay, so now about how to model Van der Waals interactions, or what people do. So on the sort of physical level, the Van der Waals forces really originate from sort of correlations in the motion of electrons in molecules and materials, and specifically from the long-range part of these correlations. And there is a myriad of different methods in sort of electronic structure methods that try to model this correlation. But essentially, there is no method that will sort of tick 3 boxes at the same time in the context of Van der Waals interactions. And that is being general, so working across a wide range of different molecules and materials under in different environments, being accurate enough for sort of interesting applications, and being computationally efficient, so you can apply to sort of large enough systems, which often are those where the Van der Waals interactions sort of are important. And in particular, there's this workhorse method of in electronic structure theory, which is called density functional theory, and that consists itself from hundreds of different approximations that people can pick for particular applications, but essentially all of the efficient ones, the semi-local and hybrid approximations, they are by construction neglecting these long-range correlations. And so this has resulted in a whole zoo of approaches how to add this missing long-range part, the Van der Waals interactions, back into density functional theory. And that's what I'm going to talk about. And so I'll start by saying that I said that there's a zoo of methods, and turns out you can classify them to some degree along 2 main axes, which is the plot here, right? So on one axis, the x-axis, you would be dividing the models into whether they are modeling the electron correlations sort of on the level, coarse grain on the level of atoms, say, or whether they are sort of fine-grained, really modeling the continuous real space density of electrons. And then on the other axis, you would have whether the correlations are modeled sort of in a simple pairwise fashion. So how does the electrons fluctuate on one atom or at one point in space, and how that correlates with another atom, or whether you're kind of going the full way and considering all the many-body interactions between these correlations, which is the right thing to do. And so the pairwise would be an approximation. And yeah, so you have these 2 axes now along which you can classify these methods, and most of the time they're pretty independent. So the different models are using kind of different approaches, and there wasn't much crossover between these different classes. So I'll talk about a model that combines ingredients from 2 different classes. And so first I'll talk about those 2 classes briefly, and it's this one, the many-body dispersion framework, and then these nonlocal functionals here. So the many-body dispersion is based on a very simple idea where you model your atomistic system by quantum harmonic oscillators. So on each atom you put a harmonic oscillator. You couple these oscillators with just dipole electrostatic interaction. Write down a Hamiltonian for it, that's here, and you solve that Hamiltonian. Has the advantage that it can be solved numerically exactly. And now assuming that you've parameterized those oscillators such that sort of the long-range electrodynamic response of them is similar to the long-range electrodynamic response of the actual atoms that you're modeling, then the long-range van der Waals interaction should also be corresponding to the true one, right? And so then this whole setup turns into the problem of how you parameterize those oscillators. And this is exactly the kind of problem that the original formulations of this approach have. So the parameterizations of the oscillators work very well for covalent systems, for sort of organic compounds. But when you went to ionic compounds like salts, or when you went to metals or hybrid systems with maybe a molecule adsorbed on a surface, then the parameterization essentially broke, and you couldn't really use them this approach at all for such systems. Now, this is the second class, or a method from the second class, the nonlocal functionals. And here it's, so this is a continuous real space approach, and it's a pairwise approximation, and it works like this. You essentially write down a double integral over space, where you do sort of the standard van der Waals C6 over R6 formula for each pair of points in space, right? So you have this R10 minus 6 here, you have some damping function, and then you have this Casimir-Polar integral for the C6 coefficient, and you're integrating some model polarizability that is written locally at each point in space, build your sort of spatially dependent C6 coefficient, and then just integrate over all pairs of points, and that's your van der Waals energy. And now, like previously, where it was all about parameterizing those oscillators, here it's about parameterizing this local polarizability functional. And so there's this simple formula from Vydrov-Van Voorhis, which works surprisingly well. And one nice trick that you can use in this approach that makes this work pretty well also for things like metals is that you can normalize it to the homogeneous electron gas, right? So by simply taking a limit of this expression when the gradient goes to 0 and subtracting it from the functional itself. So then when you have a metallic density with very small gradient, this gives you essentially a 0 contribution from van der Waals interactions, which is exactly what you need when you then combine this with the density functional description, which already captures those for metals. Okay, and so what we did is essentially combine ingredients from these two approaches to a model that solves the issues of these two approaches. So here the issue is that it's very accurate, can be very accurate, is pretty efficient, but is not general enough. It can't handle these systems. In this case, this is very general, relatively efficient as well, and but it's not accurate enough because of this approximate nature of the polarizability, and as well because it's a pairwise approximation. It's just not accurate enough compared to, say, this approach for those systems where this works. And so we wanted to combine sort of these two worlds. So we do it in 3 steps. In the first step, we take this functional and we simply coarse grain it to atoms. So you pick some partitioning of your electron density, and you simply integrate your local polarizability functional with those weights and get atomic polarizabilities. And that also gives you, by the Casimir-Polar, the atomic C6 coefficients. So that's step 1. And then to improve the accuracy, because as I said, the functional for the polarizability is fairly simple and approximate. So we want to improve that. And now that you have atomic quantities, you can do that fairly easily by simply normalizing the van der Waals coefficients to exact free atom reference parameters, right? So you have simply tabulated your polarizabilities and C6 coefficients for isolated free atoms. You calculate those polarizabilities with your functional and simply rescale so that you match and you are exact for isolated atoms. And this alone improves the performance, the accuracy quite a lot. And then in the third step, we use the same idea that's used in the non-local functional, and that is to normalize to a uniform electron gas called jellium as well. And because this is now a many-body method, we are using the many-body dispersion Hamiltonian, we can't really use the same trick because the energy is not essentially linear anymore in the polarizability of any given point or atom. And so what we do is that we kind of identify, we construct sort of two descriptors of two local descriptors of the electron density. And we sort of construct an empirical formula for how to distinguish the region of the density that are metallic. They're sort of similar to the uniform electron gas. And we don't include that to when we evaluate the polarizability, right? So we are using simply the gradient, but that alone wouldn't be enough. We are also including so-called local gap, which is sort of trying to estimate locally from the density what is the gap of the material, and then around when it's close to the uniform electron gas model, we simply exclude that from the polarizability. And so by construction, then we are the model gives 0 van der Waals energy for uniform electron gas, which is what you want. And at the same time, we exclude only small enough regions so that for, say, covalent materials, we are actually not excluding any polarizability. Okay, so then this combined, so you take the coarse-grained polarizabilities and C6 coefficients, you normalize them to free atoms, you normalize to uniform electron gas, and then you plug it back into the many-body dispersion Hamiltonian and get your van der Waals energy out of it. And so now some results with this. So when you try this on simple covalent molecules, you get essentially exactly the same performance as with the original many-body dispersion method, which is exactly what we wanted, because that accuracy is already sort of on the limit of what you can probably get with density functional theory anyway. So the goal there was simply to not decrease the performance and the accuracy on that, on these kind of systems. Likewise, when you do molecular crystals or supramolecular compounds, we get the same kind of performance and as the original many-body dispersion, and we get much better performance than the non-local functional from which we are taking the polarizability formula. And then when we go to something like solids, now you can see the benefit compared to the original many-body dispersion model, so this is a sort of baseline pure DFT performance without any dispersion correction on group of different solids. So these are transitional metals, main group metals, semiconductors, then transition metal carbonitrides, and ionic compounds. And you can see that with the original method, the original many-body dispersion model, some of these groups are completely wrong, right? So typically, most important, the metals, suddenly you have a completely overbound description. Likewise, the ionic compounds can be completely off. And so essentially, you can't really use the original Hamiltonian for modeling these kind of compounds. But with the new model, you're getting essentially a similar performance to the baseline DFT. And in the case of ionic compounds, where arguably that's what we know for a fact, that there is simply the missing van der Waals part when you're describing those systems in baseline DFT, then by adding this model, we are kind of spot on where we should be. And so now you can use this model for things like an adsorption of an organic molecule on a metal surface, right? Because we know that organic molecules are described very well by this model. We know that we can describe metal without kind of disturbing the baseline performance of density functional theory. And so now we can do a hybrid model like this one here. So this is a calculation done by other people than us, but with this model that we developed. This is benzene adsorbed on a silver surface. And you can see that you get results. So this one here, the red curve, that would be our model. And you get something that's very close to the experimental binding energy of this molecule on the surface. Whereas we should try this with the original many-body dispersion framework, you would get, you wouldn't, sometimes it wouldn't even give you any number. It would just, you couldn't diagonalize those matrices. And sometimes it would give you a completely overbound description. And now with this new model, you can get something that is pretty close to experiment. And right, so that's it. So in total, this new model that we developed essentially combines ingredients from two different groups of Van der Waals methods within density functional theory, and tries to sort of push towards a method that would at the same time be general, so being able to give you consistent description across all kinds of systems that you might be interested in, accurate enough for applications, and efficient enough so that you can use it to systems containing hundreds and thousands of systems of atoms. And right now, this is implemented in a code there's at the Freie Institute in Berlin, and as always, there's a bunch of stuff that this still doesn't cover. For example, if you have interaction between two metallic systems, then this model still isn't capturing that properly. So that's one potential way where we might want to improve this, but certainly improves upon the sort of predecessors. That's it. Thanks for listening.